my super. Okay, thank you. Okay, if you could do the next. Sorry. My honours dissertation, by the way, is anthropology, sociology, combinate with archaeology. So Moore River Native settlement for quite a few West Australian people. Moore River Native settlement, the only depiction that they have is of the Moore River Native of the Rabbit Proof fence. And so the aim of my thesis project is to explore and learn more about the settlement, how it was enacted and how it was governed. Moore River Native settlement was established in 1918 in the location of Magumba, and it was designed as a self-supporting farm and educational training institution for Aboriginal people, particularly from the southwest. So if you could do the next one. So my methodology for this was a qualitative research, and I used three different methods. One was the literature review. One was a key analysis of key dominant historical policies. And in order to understand the media's role and how the settlement was represented, I undertook a media analysis, which you can't see, in which I reviewed newspaper articles in trove, which I limited to the search the West Australian newspaper, the Moore River Native settlement, and between the dates of 1917 to 1951. Next one. So my thesis question was, how did the WA West Australian government seek to control the Aboriginal population through the Moore River Native settlement? So I identified three key themes for the governance and policy of enacting the settlement, and these were control, representation, and resistance of agency. Okay, so now what I'm going to look at is my theoretical and conceptual framework. My meta theory is policy assemblage. And the reason for using this is because policy is not linear. It's sometimes seen as that it's not limited to a material policy documentation, but it is an assemblage of multiple actors, forces, and over time and space. So as Leah suggests, policy is wild and it's messy. It's not something that appears out of nowhere and is implemented and just followed. As Susan Mousehart says, Moore River's objectives at a time where she is schizophrenic. So if you could go to, sorry, no, if you stay on there, sorry. Sorry, gosh, it's been, okay. So first of all, I'm looking at control. So Goffman, first of all, I'm looking at Erving Goffman and his insights into total institutions. And I'm saying that Moore River Native settlement was based on total institutions, ones that are governed by an overseeing authority that controlled the everyday situation of Moore River Native settlement. It was governed by large blocks of individuals, were managed by the implications of bureaucracy. And there were barriers there. It was isolated, but there were also barriers there as far as fences and locked doors and all those sorts of things. And similarly, I looked at Foucault's discipline and and also into his narrative of Bentham's panopticon and prisons, and how individuals were isolated from outside world, and they were enforced daily schedulings of work and residence in one location. Isolation is the key theme of both Goffman and Foucault. The next theme that I looked at was representation, and I looked at Stuart Hall and Raywall, and particularly Hall talks about how race and ethnicity were represented through the media, and the analysis of media representations is key to understanding these representations and how they serve the interests of those in positions of power, bureaucracy and governance. And Raywall also talks about mediatisation, which is the process of governing bodies and how they use the media to gain power and shape the relations between different fields. And for example, in this thesis, I argued that the bureaucratic departments, such as the Aborigines Department, controlled how the settlement was represented through the West Australian newspaper to the wider public. And the last one I look at is resistance. And I draw from Ureta and his term, strange things. And what he states is that with policy, what is not originally considered when implementing policy is that attempts to control individuals can invariably lead to actions of human agency as individuals respond to the challenges of their given scripts. and that the individuals are not seeking to resist, but instead act with agency. And also Leah talks about wild policy, and she states that policies are wild, not the people being targeted, and that policy is not this neatly assembled package, but is wild and not a one-off event. She also identifies that resistance is a natural part of policy making. So the next slide, I'm looking at sort of like an overview of each of my results chapters that I've come across, and I demonstrate through my policy analysis how the government tried to control the Aboriginal and part Aboriginal population. And in the early 1900s, newspaper articles were in Europe and also in interstate were talking about how WA was mistreating the Aboriginal population in the northwest, which Biscup says was an increase of racial prejudice at the time based on the perceived economic threat of the increasing Aboriginal population. And to address this, the Roth Royal Commission was instigated in 1905, and that looked at the northwest area, and he had two key themes which I'm going to draw on today. And one was, if Aboriginal children were left with their families, they could resort to vagabondism and harlotry. So that was one of his findings under the present state of the law. The other thing was that he decided that the Chief Protector of Aborigines needed more authority, i.e. the guardianship of children up to the ages of 18 years and under. So because of his recommendations and findings, the Aborigines Act was implemented in 1905, and the two key sections that I'm going to look at this, one was that the Chief Protector of Aborigines was given guardianship over children 16, so they lowered the age, 16 years and under. And also in the Act, institutions are defined as for the benefit, protection and care of Aboriginal, Aborigines and half-caste children. So in between the Aborigines Act and the Moore River settlement being organised was the Native Settlement Scheme was implemented by a few Aboriginal administrators, including A.O. Neville. And when Neville became Chief Protector in 1915, he actually opened up the Moore River Native Settlement, which is sometimes called Neville's Baby. It was in 1918. It was the second settlement in the southwest. The first was the Carrolup settlement in Katanning in 1915. So the Moore River Native Settlement, as we saw, can be defined as a total institution. Isolation was the key principle. Its barren location with fences around it. It had daily timetables for the inmates. And also the children wore uniforms of what was called tough marked cloth, which was a khaki coarse cloth that they wore during the day and also at night. They had a relatively poor diet. They were lived in dormitory accommodation for boys and girls, and it was across all ages. And they were literally locked into these dormitories at night between 6:30 at night and 6:30 in the morning. And part of this was because of the minimal staff they had. They just thought it easier to lock them into these settlements. Okay, if you could do the next one. Thank you. So with representation, what I looked at was the Western Australian newspaper. And what I go through in my thesis, and I look at here, was that there were sort of three key elements. The first element was the enactment of the settlement, and this pretty much was between 1917 to 1932. And it was sort of the enactment of the settlement. It was, as Susan Mousehart says, aggressively positive in tone in its representation in the West Australian newspaper. She says that it was sort of like, had a slightly utopian type of view, that the settlement was, the government were basically portraying this sort of positive tone of the settlement to sort of let the public know that they'd been successful in their solution of implementing the Moore River Native Settlement. And during this period, and part of my computer crashing is that I've actually got my old slides on here, it was actually an average of 7 articles per year were printed in the West Australian newspaper between the years of 1917 to 1932. So that's sort of almost one every 2 months about the settlement. So as my title says, out of sight, out of mind, it was pretty much out of sight, out of mind during this period. Then the second period was between 1933 and 1939, and the Moseley Royal Commission was enacted in this time, and suddenly the settlement had been portrayed as very positive, mostly, And the Moseley Commission found that the settlement was in actual fact terrible. The conditions were terrible, the dormitories were terrible, the structures and the way the children were being treated and the adults. And he actually infamously stated that it was a woeful spectacle. And suddenly, as you can see, the articles suddenly increased to 33 articles on average a year, which is really still only 3 a month. And there was, people coming out critical about the actual conditions of the settlement. Then the people like Neville were very defensive about what they were doing, and people were supporting it as well. So there was a lot of criticism and a lot of defensive during this period. And then in 1948, the Bateman inquiry was instigated, and during this time, Bateman, he also mirrored what Moseley had said. He basically said there's no possible chance of this settlement being able to continue if it goes, the conditions that they are at the moment. And he also said that hygiene is merely words without meaning. And so the actual settlement itself was terrible at this stage, and only 3 years later it actually closed down. But at this time as well, even though the settlement, his inquiry was standing, as you can see, the average of the articles went down to 15. People were sort of pretty over it, it seems, by the representation of the settlement, and so people literally stopped. It stopped being printed in the article. There was in the paper there was only 1 article on average per month. Okay, thank you. All right, so we've gone ahead to, if you could just go back to 2, and the next one. Oh, yeah, sorry. Oh, I didn't get you to keep going with them. That's my fault. Sorry, if you could keep going. That's right. So now I'm looking at, sorry, yes, you're right. Resistance and agency, if you can go back. That's it, sorry. It's because I've got the different slides it's throwing me. Okay, so what I'm going to do with my last results chapter, I demonstrate that resistance and agency is a component of control. So I will draw from the section on teenage girls who escape, pretty much considered by Mouseheart as the most powerless segment of the settlement's population. The girls escaped the Moore River dormitory accommodation for freedom and were most likely not conscious of performing an act of resistance, but as teenagers, they probably just wanted some freedom. Some of them had been there since they were little kids and they just wanted that freedom. And as I put that quote up, because I think that's really quite telling, Mouseheart's quote, and I'll just read it, "They persistently violated the institution's heavily guarded boundaries in time and space, the schedules and rosters, the cells and fences, the long trail of iron that lay between the settlement and town." And that image there shows you the settlement and its structure. And these girls may have wanted freedom, but reports instead problematized it. And suddenly the reports were talking in terms of teenage pregnancy and clandestine meetings. And the settlement policy was to provide a stronger mesh netting on the dormitory, on the windows and the doors, and increased surveillance and further control. The girls also faced punishment, which was being placed in isolation and solitary confinement in a structure that was called the booth. Sometimes the inmates could be confined up to 2 weeks and they were given bread and water. Another report suggests that locking the dormitory door, this is just awful, is like locking the stable door after the horse is bolted. And again, his reports talk about girls' pregnancy rates and sexual relations. And so problematising it limited these girls' acts of freedom into acts of making the policy settlement about more control. And although any problems at the settlement, such as escaping, were put down by Neville and his colleagues to a lack of funding and blame and the inability of Aboriginal people to adapt to the policies. And I feel that the final resistance was the settlement itself, as in 1951 it closed and was handed over to the Methodist mission. So if you can do the next one. So my conclusion and discussion is that total control, as Foucault says, is a oxymoron. As this thesis is about how bureaucracy tried to control the state's Aboriginal population through the assemblage of policy, ultimately it was never going to succeed. My conclusion will explore the notion of the Great White Silence that saw Aboriginal past excised from the public narrative, and in identifying how the Moore River native settlement functioned and how this was represented to the public serves as a lens to understand what precipitated the silence in the past. Moore River was originally meant to be out of sight and out of mind, and even though this changed over time, this thesis aims to bring into sight and mind the process of truth-telling. And I will flesh out more ideas as they come, but I'd appreciate any feedback and comments and questions. Thank you. If you want to go through to the last slide. Sorry, a few things like slides and everything just to look through them, so yes. Yes. Yeah.
I saw Greg had his hand up on the screen.
Oh, Greg. No, not Greg. I saw Greg no questions. Yes.
Yeah. So now questions.
Thanks.
Stop sharing. Thank you. You have some.
Yeah, I've got questions.
Okay, Sam.
Yeah, very interesting talk. A few bits were a little unclear over the laptop, so I'm sorry if this was addressed in your speech and I just didn't hear it. At the end, you raised the settlement was meant to be out of sight and out of mind. Was it meant to be like that because they were aware that it would be problematic in the public eye and they wanted to suppress that? Or was the out of sight, out of mind more emerging from a sense that this would just be a policy orderly conducted, and because it was orderly and it would achieve its goals, it would be invisible and there would be no need for it to be in the public eye?
Yes, actually, that last part that you mentioned then, originally, that's actually right. That was the original implementation. Interestingly enough, one thing that I talk about in my thesis, if that sort of assists with this, is that Neville talks about how he sort of sees the settlement as a clearinghouse. He sort of assumed that this would actually be a short-term process and that in the future, it wouldn't actually be needed anymore. So, so that was his thoughts on this, that it would actually be a short-term process and then it would no longer be required as the children sort of were assimilated into the wider society. So originally, the way I sort of see it through my research is that it was implemented as out of sight and out of mind, because that was the process of removing people and putting them in this isolated setting. And what I'm looking at is though whether that's what they actually imagined, and I don't really think they actually knew how it was going to play out. It didn't play out how Neville thought it would. That in the end, that it wasn't out of mind, out of sight because of the, you know, how it was portrayed through the West Australian. So I think it sort of changed over the time, but I think the original plan was, yes, for it to be out of mind, out of sight.
And do you see like the sort of, I mean, maybe you haven't gotten to this in your research yet, but do you see sort of the rhetoric and rationalities used to justify it being out of sight, out of mind? How do they sort of mutate over time? Like, do they continue to employ ones based on like efficiency and effectiveness and there's no need to see things here as things go on, or does it change?
Oh, it changes. And I think the reason where I got out of sight, out of mind from, because Susan Mountheit, who wrote a lot about the Moore River Native settlement, she actually talks about out of mind, out of sight, out of mind. She's actually very critical of the public. She feels that there were lots of representations in the paper, even though I see that there weren't that many articles. She felt that there was lots of information to the public, and she's actually very critical of the public and sort of says, well, if there was so much out of information, that it wasn't out of sight, out of mind. Neville brings up out of sight, out of mind as well, but he sort of sees it more in the situation that people would be removed from the public and out of sight, out of mind.
Right. And so I'm sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but what you just said brought something else to mind, which is more methodological, which is just like, as well as just counting articles, perhaps it would be worthwhile to consider where they appear in the paper. Because of course, it's one thing to say this was addressed however many times a month. It's another thing to say this thing was front page news or this thing appeared on page 10. So I don't know, maybe something to think about. Thanks for the talk.
And if you're still listening, I know you've gone, but that's something I actually did. And originally in my original presentation, I had the content analysis that I did. Something I don't think I said in this, I mentioned, was that I actually analysed 520 articles. And one of the columns I do have is the page. So originally it was later in the page, but remembering how the West Australian, from my knowledge of it, originally things like situations vacant and even advertisements were actually on the front page. So the way we have the paper now is the front page uses the important ones. In actual fact, it was a little bit different. That's something I haven't really sort of spent a lot of time analysing, but from where I understand it, it did change over that period as to what the paper, how the paper situated different articles. And a lot of these, in these numbers that I have, and going back to it, is that even though I say that there were 33 articles a year and 15 articles, particularly the last one when I'm talking about 7 articles, because of the war and also because of the Depression, there was such minimal staff and they had so many problems getting staff that there was a large number of situations vacant articles, and so that actually reduces the number of articles that were actually presented about government reports and so on. Thanks for your question.
I think we can take up questions from the floor.
I think, can I make a suggestion? Because this is an honest presentation and the idea is to give Tania as much feedback as possible.
Yep.
Why don't we listen to all the questions and then give Tania an opportunity to respond to some, so that she gets to hear all the questions, because that's the most important thing, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and also, but I also have to remind you that we have limited time. We have 3 minutes left. We have the second presenter.
Yeah, so that's why I'm
So,
suggesting
yes.
that. Yeah. So why don't we just collect all the questions to Tania?
Thanks, Tania. Mine, probably not so much a question, but a comment about the broader legislative and policy context in Western Australia towards Aboriginal people as reflected in mission services throughout the state. And I'm thinking about the work of Anna Haig in this one, who of course addresses this, but there's others, there's a whole bunch of other writing on this and how you situate your work within that broader legislative framework as well. Those things. The law, the 1905 Aboriginals Act. And you don't need to answer.
But just so you know, I do use Haybig and Biscup and everyone. So yeah, I found they've actually been quite a strong part of my literature review. So yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, that was excellent. My question sort of was around, obviously you looked at representation like in media and so on, and I was wondering how you're managing representation and how, I guess, you have designed the project to try and, I guess, counter some of the really problematic aspects of representation in the past, and how you're, or if you are, for example, using sort of more individualising sort of approaches, and how you're trying to humanise, I guess, the people who experience these wild policies, etc.
Absolutely. If I can just quickly say, one of my key things is sewing girls, and how images of girls who are just happily sewing, and then other articles talk about that they're producing 8,000 garments. That just gets said over and over again. And so there's a lot of different things. It would actually be great to do a PhD on it, because it's actually, I feel that there's so much information. Yeah, thank you.
But actually, thank you so much for your presentation. It actually reminds me when I was visiting more and more river settlement as our own country visit by year because rivers and flooding. So we had a lot of inside story where some mothers actually residing there, a lot of services like healing now. So my point is, in terms of time dimension, because I notice your title is in present tense, how does the government seek control? And I'm thinking this, obviously your research is historical and is looking at so much articles and literature that has existed, but does it have that time dimension today and how that has probably transformed? And because the legacy is there, it's not going anywhere, people are still living and the site is still in my very strong environment. this happened, probably things come to mind like labor, post-labor, all the other things, and social isolation especially. But I'm just wondering how you bring the time present into the historical dimension, if that's a lot
Thank you. And two things, because I know we've got to go, but two things. One is, Glenn keeps correcting me on that, so thank you. I keep talking it in the now, but I think part of it, and I appreciate the comments because I keep talking about it in the present tense. I think if I can just answer my conclusion, I don't think, because I don't think I expressed it properly, but to bring up your point, I think that what I'm looking at is how it was silent for so long, as Stanhope talks about, but also Lydon talks about it in terms of how it was excised from the public narrative, but how this is a process, this thesis is a process of truth-telling. Like you said, it's like a continual, and I know that things are happening in the settlement now, and changes are happening to sort of make it more of a cultural heritage sort of place. So that, if that answers what you were talking about, but yes. And of course, because it is part of a policy assemblage, it's just one little tiny aspect, and because there's so many big parts about it, I suppose that's what I'm seeing in the present tense as well, because of that continuation into the present. But yeah, I think that's something to address. Thank you.